Imagine if the oldest written stories on Earth weren't just myths about gods and kings, but a coded explanation for why human beings exist at all. Not who discovered fire, not who built the first city, but why we were made in the first place, and why the ones who made us seem to step back, go silent, and leave us to carry the burden alone. Because hidden inside ancient Mesopotamian texts is a story that sounds disturbingly modern. A group of higher beings create humanity to do the work they no longer want to do. They shape people deliberately, they assign roles, they solve a labor crisis by making a new species. And then, once that species becomes too loud, too numerous, too difficult to control, they don't elevate us. They limit us. That's the part people rarely focus on. When this story gets retold online, it usually comes packaged as a simple headline. The Sumerians said aliens engineered humanity. But the real story is more interesting than the viral version because it sits in that eerie space between theology, power, labor, and memory. And once you hear the full pattern, the question isn't just whether ancient people believed they were created. The question is why their creators sound so disappointed with the result. First, we need to clear up one huge misconception. People often talk about the tablet, singular, as if one dramatic slab of clay contains the whole secret. It doesn't. The idea is spread across several Mesopotamian texts and traditions, especially stories like Enki and Ninmah, Atrahasis, and later Babylonian creation material. In other words, this isn't one shocking line ripped from one artifact. It's a recurring worldview, and that worldview begins with a problem. Before humans existed, the gods were working, not ruling from a distance, working, digging canals, clearing riverbeds, maintaining the order of the world. In the Atrahasis tradition, the lower-ranking gods get tired of this backbreaking labor and rebel. They burn their tools. They surround the house of the chief god. It's essentially a divine strike. Creation doesn't begin as an act of love. It begins as a labor dispute. So the gods do what powerful beings throughout history have always been tempted to do when labor becomes unbearable. They create a class beneath them to carry the load. And before we go deeper, tell me this in the comments. Do you hear this as pure myth or as a distorted memory of something real that ancient people struggled to explain? That is where the story turns from strange to unforgettable. In these texts, humanity is not described as an accident. We are a solution, a designed answer to a specific problem. In one version, a god is sacrificed and his blood is mixed with clay. In another, divine figures knead clay from the deep and fashion human beings into existence. The purpose is consistent. Humans are made so the gods can stop doing the hard work themselves. Think about how radical that is. Not created to conquer the stars, not created as the center of the universe, not even created primarily for wisdom, created for labor, for maintenance, for burden-bearing, for service. That alone is enough to explain why this story never dies. It lands right on one of humanity's deepest fears. What if our lives were never meant to be free? What if the oldest story about us says we were built to serve systems larger than ourselves? And then comes the detail that fuels the engineered humanity interpretation. In Enki and Ninmah, the creation of humans is described in language that sounds, at least to modern ears, deliberate and technical. Shapes are devised, forms are fashioned, specific kinds of people are made and then assigned specific destinies or functions. The text even lingers on human variation, as if the act of making people includes experimentation with outcomes, limitations, and roles. If you approach that story already thinking in the language of genetics, design, or bioengineering, it's easy to see why some readers leap from created to engineered. And online, that leap has become its own genre. Every few months, another video, post, or podcast revives the same claim. The Anunnaki weren't gods, they were extraterrestrials. The clay is symbolic for genetic material. The blood is some ancient way of describing biological coding. Humanity was modified to work mines, build cities, or serve a superior species. It's a powerful narrative because it updates an old myth with modern anxieties. We no longer fear being molded from mud, we fear being programmed. But here's where the story gets more nuanced. The ancient texts themselves do not talk about DNA. They do not describe spacecraft. They do not present the Anunnaki as aliens in the way modern pop culture imagines aliens. In mainstream scholarship, the Anunnaki are gods within Mesopotamian religion, not hidden astronauts from another planet. That doesn't make the story less fascinating. It makes it more revealing, because now we're forced to ask a deeper question. If this is myth, why did one of the world's earliest civilizations imagine human existence in such stark utilitarian terms? Why did they imagine us as workers first? Maybe because they were living inside one of the first great urban civilizations on Earth, a world of irrigation, temple economies, hierarchy, kingship, grain storage, flood control, and endless labor. In that kind of society, it makes sense that the universe itself would be imagined as a system that requires upkeep. If canals collapse, fields die. If rituals stop, order unravels. If work ceases, chaos returns. So of course, the origin story mirrors the civilization. Someone must carry the load. If you appreciate ancient mysteries more when the real texts are allowed to stay strange instead of being flattened into clickbait, hit like. Because the untouched version of this story is already unsettling enough. Now let's talk about the beings at the center of it. In these traditions, the divine world is not morally simple. Some gods are sympathetic to humans, some are not. Enki, often associated with wisdom and creation, is repeatedly connected to the making and preservation of humanity. Enlil, in some versions, becomes frustrated with humans once they multiply and make too much noise. That detail matters more than it seems. Noise, not evil, not rebellion, not corruption, at least not at first. Noise, human existence itself becomes irritating to the powers above. The creatures made to solve one problem become a new problem. So the same world that created humanity now starts looking for ways to reduce humanity. This is where the abandoned us idea becomes truly compelling. Because in the Mesopotamian flood tradition, especially Atrahasis, the gods don't simply walk away in one dramatic cinematic exit. Their withdrawal is more chilling than that. First, they try to manage humanity through suffering, plague, drought, famine. When that fails, a flood is sent to wipe humanity out. One god quietly helps a human survivor endure it. But after the catastrophe, the relationship changes. The divine order no longer seems interested in intimate closeness. Instead, boundaries are imposed, mortality remains, fertility is controlled, and human life becomes more sharply limited. If you read that as theology, it's a myth about cosmic order. If you read it psychologically, it's a civilization wrestling with the pain of existence. If you read it through the lens of ancient astronaut speculation, it becomes the story of creators who realized their experiment had gone too far and chose distance over involvement. And maybe that third interpretation stays alive because it echoes how modern people feel. We are surrounded by systems we did not design, obligations we did not choose, and technologies that increasingly make us wonder whether intelligence creates tools, or tools eventually reshape the beings that use them. So when an ancient story says humans were built for function and then left within limits, it doesn't feel ancient. It feels current. But there's another layer here most people miss. The so-called abandonment may not only be about the gods leaving. It may also be about humans waking up. In many creation myths, the beginning is close, intimate, magical. Gods speak directly. The world is new. Boundaries are thin. But as the story progresses, distance increases. That distance is what makes civilization possible. Once humans are no longer standing face to face with the divine, they must organize themselves. Build law, build memory, build ritual, build history. In a strange way, being abandoned is what forces humanity to become humanity. That makes the story darker and more powerful. Because maybe the ancient fear wasn't simply that our makers left. Maybe it was that they left on purpose, because dependence could never be the final state. Maybe the flood, the suffering, the limits, the silence, all of it marks the painful transition from being made to being responsible. Still, the literalist reading refuses to disappear, and it's easy to understand why. The language of formation, hybrid ingredients, assigned functions, and controlled reproduction sounds eerily compatible with modern concepts of engineering. When a text talks about mixing divine substance with earth, shaping forms, and establishing human purpose, the imagination does what it always does. It updates the metaphor with the most powerful technology available. In the Bronze Age, that was divine craft. Today, it's genetic design. And that raises a question worth sitting with. When we say the ancients described engineering, are we discovering what they meant, or projecting what we fear? Because projection is part of this story too. The Sumerians and Babylonians projected their political world into heaven. Kingship, labor, hierarchy, duty, punishment, survival, these all appear in their cosmos. We do the same thing now. We project corporations, laboratories, algorithms, and extraterrestrials into the past. We see creators and imagine coders. We see clay and imagine biotech. We see divine withdrawal and imagine a cancelled program. So, maybe the real mystery is not whether the tablet describes beings who engineered humanity. Maybe the real mystery is why humanity, across thousands of years, keeps returning to the suspicion that we are not fully self-authored. That suspicion shows up everywhere. In religion, where people ask why we were made. In philosophy, where people ask whether freedom is real. In science fiction, where creators lose control of their creations. In artificial intelligence, where we are now the ones making systems whose future behavior we can't fully predict. And suddenly, those ancient stories stop feeling primitive. They feel prophetic. I want to know your take on this part. Is the more disturbing idea that humans were created for a purpose, or that we may never truly know what that purpose was? Now let's return to the title question. Why did they abandon us? If you want the sensational answer, it's this. Because the project became unstable. Humanity multiplied, disrupted the balance, and the creators withdrew after trying to contain the damage. If you want the mythic answer, it's this. Because the relationship between gods and humans was always meant to be asymmetrical. We were made to serve, not to stand beside them, and once our role was established, distance was inevitable. If you want the historical answer, it's this. Because ancient societies explained suffering by imagining a world in which humans were necessary, dependent, and never fully in control. The gods did not need to abandon humanity physically. The structure of life already felt like abandonment. And if you want the human answer, maybe it's the hardest one. We tell stories about creators leaving because absence is one of the oldest experiences we know. Parents die, empires fall, certainty disappears, the flood comes, the harvest fails, the heavens go silent. And instead of saying life is random, civilizations say something else once walked with us, and now it doesn't. That is why these tablets still matter. Not because they give us clean proof of aliens, not because they confirm every viral theory about the Anunnaki, but because they preserve one of the earliest and most haunting ideas ever written down. Human beings may have been made with intent, yet still forced to live with uncertainty. Designed, but not fully informed. Needed, but not cherished. Created, and then left to make sense of creation on our own. And that may be why the story refuses to die. Because whether you read it as myth, memory, metaphor, or warning, it touches the same nerve. The fear that our lives began inside a purpose we did not choose, and the challenge of deciding what to do after the makers go quiet. If you're into ancient texts, lost civilizations, and the moments where mythology starts sounding uncomfortably modern, subscribe. Because some of history's oldest stories become the most revealing when you stop asking whether they're literally true, and start asking why they were told that way in the first place. So no, the Sumerian world did not hand us a neat sci-fi instruction manual explaining DNA labs and alien machinery. What it gave us was something more enduring. A creation story where humanity is fashioned under pressure, assigned a burden, nearly erased, and then left inside a world where survival depends on memory, adaptation, and meaning. And maybe that is the final sting in the tale. The beings in the tablets may or may not have engineered humanity, depending on how literally you want to read the word. But they absolutely shaped one of the oldest ideas humans ever had about themselves, that we arrived here owing a debt, that life feels like work because it was imagined that way from the beginning, and that if the gods ever did stand close to us, they are far enough away now that whatever happens next is on us.